Well, Mr. Davis, Baroness Jones, we are very grateful for you coming along to the committee. We think that you've got some very interesting things to say about this bill, and I'll kick off by asking a question which is so general you can then make a general statement before individual questions. So perhaps to Mr. Davis and then Baroness Jones after the same question. Is this bill necessary, and to what extent does it address your concerns, if it does at all, about legislation in this area?
Welcome, Mr. Chairman. It was either you or the Berlin Christmas market. You won this time. So I just leapt off the plane here. So, is it necessary? Well, yes, it is necessary. There's no doubt that we need a new bill. It's taking over. Well, if you take David Anderson's count, something like 66 different statutory mechanisms for various forms of interception, data gathering and so on, many of them based on bad laws. I mean, RIPA's bad law, I'm sure some of your witnesses have told you that already, but very badly written, badly drafted, and I can come back to that in a minute. And it's also taking over laws that were used in ways that I'm quite sure that Parliament didn't intend. I would have hoped it would have consolidated all of the surveillance, the electronic surveillance laws into one area. It hasn't done that. So its first failing is it hasn't concluded that. You've just had law enforcement agencies, haven't you? I mean, I think the Police Act is still effective. So IMSI catchers, the devices that block, intercept mobile phones, for example, will go around this. And that's part of the propensity to expand on the part of the agencies. All agencies in the world expand their powers, and this encourages it. It's good for another reason, and that is, in a consolidated form, it will be possible not to future-proof it, but to future-adapt it. I mean, a lot of the argument that you get from the agencies is, oh, we're going to make this future-proof, which tends to be an argument for making things more general, more open, more loose. And I think that's a bad idea. But I think we're probably going to have to get into the habit of, just as we have a Finance Act every year and a Companies Act every year or two, we're probably going to have one of these acts every Parliament anyway, because of the rate of change in technology. Does it meet all my concerns? Well, you'd be surprised if I said yes, wouldn't you, really? The answer is no. I think on authorisation, which again I'm sure we'll come back to, I think it's a missed opportunity, because I think there was developing a sort of new consensus around judicial authorisation, so I think they've sort of missed that. It's certainly not what somebody described as world leading. If I had to pick the world leading country in this area, I'd probably pick the United States as to where it's arriving at now, rather than ours. I don't think the double lock is very good. And it claims to introduce one new power, but in practice you've got internet connection records, but you've also got effective recognition or avowal of bulk equipment interference, bulk personal data sets, bulk data, even thematic warrants, which, although they weren't formally approved by Parliament, somehow were invented out of RIPA. So there are a whole series of areas where it's weak, but broadly speaking, we have to have a bill along these lines.
Thank you very much. Baroness Jones, if I just repeat the question, is the bill necessary, and to what extent does it address any concerns you might have about legislation in this area?
Lord Chairman, thank you very much. I'm missing our team Christmas do, and they're all in the pub waiting for me, so I'm sure you'll understand if I speak quickly. I suppose you could say it's necessary because times are moving on, and obviously we now have huge ability in this sort of surveillance, and so some sort of way of containing it and monitoring it is incredibly important. And the majority of powers in here are new. My concern is twofold. First of all, that these are actually now just sort of covering what has been done up to now, because the laws that have existed so far have been broken and abused many times by security agencies and by the Met. And I have quite a list, if I can perhaps give you that subsequently. And so I'm concerned that there is a good operational case for this, and that they really do understand how to use the powers. I'm concerned that they're going to use these powers to spy on people who are actually holding them to account, because this is what's happened already, that security agencies and the Met Police have actually used powers that they don't have to spy on people. For example, Doreen Lawrence, who is trying to hold the police to account. Mark Thomas, who is a comedian who tries to hold the state to account. Journalists, there's 5 journalists that have been spied on so far. And even I had for 10 years, when I was an elected person sitting on the police authority, I had a file on me in the Met's domestic extremist database, so which I think is fairly outrageous. I'm quite clear my life is quite public and there was nothing to hide, so I don't feel I was intruded upon, but at the same time, what a terrible waste of time and resources, and I think not just unnecessary but unlawful at that stage. There's also the fact that Snowden has told us that GCHQ intercept 50 billion internet communications a day. Now that's an astonishing amount of data coming in. And over the years, I've asked the Met Police how many databases they have to get an idea of how much information might be coming in. They couldn't tell me to the nearest 100. They couldn't tell me to the nearest 1,000 how many databases they had. So we're looking at something that's actually potentially very complicated, a vast amount of information coming in, and do they have the skills to deal with it?
Thank you. Ms. Finnan.
It's just one general question. Do you agree that the bill before us today represents progress compared to the draft communications data bill in 2012?
Well, I would say that there are things in here that I'm deeply unhappy about.
But compared to what we last saw in 2012, in respect of now we don't have local authorities having any powers, and that's a movement, isn't it? From
that is.
Well, there are marginal improvements, no doubt about that. And as I said, the fact that there is a single bill of itself is an improvement. But it's a long, long way short of what it should be. I mean, one of the things that worries me, Chairman, and I hope you take this in the spirit which is intended, is it can be incredibly difficult for you as a committee to actually deal with this bill in the time available. It's an enormous bill. It's absolutely enormous when you take on board all the newly avowed powers. I mean, they're not new powers in the sense of being used, but they're new to Parliament. And actually assessing whether they're right or wrong, whether they're effective or ineffective, whether they're proportionate in terms of the erosion of privacy, it's going to be incredibly difficult. And in this business, speed is the enemy of wisdom, so it's quite difficult. But my comment is there are granny footsteps towards a better position. But you know, we mustn't miss this opportunity to get this right, both from the point of view of protecting the values that we're supposed to protect, but on the other hand, of making the agencies more effective, because they're behaving in a very different way to some of our allies who are arguably more effective than we.
The government did appear to make some concessions because there was quite a furore about this. And, for example, they brought in judicial review, but the judicial review is very, very light and, in fact, can be completely ignored. So ministers, if they decide there's some sense of urgency, then they can go around the judges altogether, in spite of the fact that the Royal Courts of Justice have a judge on duty 24 hours a day. So there are those, they appeared as concessions, but actually they just don't go far enough.
We moved out Lord Butler.
Just if I may follow that point up, when you say that the government could ignore the judges completely, are you referring to the 5 days, within 5 days, if it's a matter of urgency?
Yes. But
well, that's not, surely, if I may respectfully say so, ignoring the judges completely. It just means that
they can bypass them. And
for 5 days?
Yeah. Perhaps I can talk about the volume of stuff that's coming in. They will have to apply for the Prime Minister will be told if there is a warrant for people like us, for example, privileged people. For me, those are the people that we are going to have to be very concerned about. These are the people who get whistleblowers coming to them, whether it's journalists, ministers of religion, parliamentarians, or whatever. The Prime Minister will be notified of a warrant, but doesn't have the right to reject that necessarily. And a judge can look. The warrant, I think, will go to a judge. Am I saying this wrong? And if the judge doesn't agree to it, and the judge only reviews it, or the commissioner only reviews it, the judge doesn't actually is able to say yes or no. The minister can then take it to the investigatory powers commissioner, who can overrule the initial commissioner. So there are lots of ways, I think, that these things can be pushed through.
I won't continue this, but the Investigatory Powers Commissioner is, of course, a judge.
Well, yes.
Could I just get on to...
No, but can I
Sorry,
give you
please.
my view of this? It's not, no, not at all. It's not just not the same. I don't view the accelerated procedure as a necessary bypass. I think it's going to have to be refined in some ways. But there are circumstances when fast decisions have to be made. I mean, the London-Glasgow bombings, for example, telephone data was very important in that, and you had to make a decision very, very quickly indeed, maybe in minutes. So you have to have a procedure like that. There is, of course, in my view, a need to keep a very close eye on it, maybe publish how many times that is triggered every year, and frankly make it plain to an officer who uses that procedure that if he's in the wrong, there'll be a mandatory warning on his record. But I don't see it as a bypass, so I don't agree with that.
Thank you very much. Could I get on to bulk interception? Are you satisfied, if I may ask each of you in turn, that the operational case has been made for bulk interception, bulk acquisition of the collection of communications data, and bulk equipment interference? And perhaps I could, as it were, use my second bit of ammunition before I ask you that question. I mean, this is a matter that David Anderson looked at and said he was satisfied that those powers were necessary. Do you agree with him?
Can I go first? Not entirely. Let's take bulk interception first. I think it's insufficiently narrowly defined. For foreign, for example, I mean, Charles Farr, when he gave evidence to in 2012, I think it was, said that the selectors on the bulk intercept data would allow them to treat British to foreign, obviously pick up British to foreign intercepts, and to treat accessing Facebook, accessing Twitter, accessing a foreign platform as appropriate for this. And it seems to me that's too broad, and that they haven't made the case to justify that broader. And if we're talking about bulk intercept of a fibre optic going through Cyprus to Pakistan, I'm going to be more relaxed about it than I am about Bute. So that's the first thing. Your others were bulk acquisition, I think, of communications data. I think the best model here is America. They have basically recoiled from that after the President's panel looked at their, a really, really deep look, by a previous head of the Director of National Intelligence, and with very serious counter-terrorism lawyers on the panel, and they looked at it and they came to the conclusion it simply wasn't worth it, what they were doing there. And I think we'd have to make a much stronger case to come back on that. Bulk equipment interference. Individual targeted equipment interference is obviously a necessity, particularly in this day of intercept. It's one way of, in this day of encryption. It's one way of going around encryption, and probably the most effective. But bulk interference worries me a lot. I do think that's a very, very serious intrusion of everybody's privacy. I mean, we know already that one of the agencies has effectively suborned very large numbers of SIM cards, I think in the millions. That sort of thing worries me. Apart from the direct assault on individuals' privacy by the state, the fact that it would actually undermine the integrity of their own personal security to anybody else, to a blackmailer, to somebody trying to intercept them. One group you didn't mention, that I'm going to raise, because it almost falls off the tongue, is the bulk personal data sets as well, which there's very, very little, but it's avowed, but very, very little in here. And I think that really is something, if it's not for me to give the committee advice, but if I was going to point at something that needs to be looked at, I'd look very hard at that as well, because this explicitly has been sort of disavowed, as it were, as an approach by the Americans and others. And it really is completely antagonistic to the things that the current government and the previous government said that they set their faces against. In the identity card arguments, the primary argument about the identity card was not carrying a plastic card. It was the existence of a central national database of personal data on every citizen. And it sounds to me as though we've had that since 2000. certainly 2005 and possibly 2001, which is what shocked Mr. Clegg. So I think there are a very large number of areas where other people have found that these are very bad ideas and don't work and have recoiled from them. Sometimes even the agencies without external intervention on cost-effectiveness methods. And I think we need to do a much tougher, more challenging attack on this if we're going to justify it.
If I'm just on that last point,
Yeah.
bulk personal data,
Yeah.
are you reassured by the fact that this would now, under the bill, require a warrant which would have to be endorsed by a judge?
Well, that's an improvement, but the very holding of this, I mean, I don't know, Chairman, whether you're able to see what they have in terms of data sets there, because we're pretty sure, at least on the reporting in the register today, we're pretty sure that they've got all the communications data, they've got flight data. They've probably got almost certainly got financial data. They may well have ANPR data. Now, this is very, very intrusive information for a state to hold. And we've been having arguments for the last 10 years about whether or not we should have a central database for ID cards, whether or not we should have communications data, and hence the stalling of the so-called Snoopers Charter, when in fact this has existed all through that. So one of the things I would hope the committee would come to a view on is what's in this, because there are arguments that there are hundreds of data sets here, hundreds of data sets per person, and that's really very serious. So yes, you're right, warranting is good, but frankly the extent to which much of this database should exist is very debatable.
Thank you.
There's also, of course, medical records in those data sets and financial asset records and so on, so it's a very wide scope.
Yes. So Baroness Jones, do you want to add anything on bulk collection?
I mean, the bulk collection of domestic phone records, of course, has been proved in the States under a similar power to be ineffective, and the President's Review Group said it was not essential to preventing attacks. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board concluded that they hadn't identified a single instance involving a threat to the United States from that sort of collection, so I would argue it's a very limited value.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Atkins.
Just on that point, you've listed all sorts of types of information. What is the basis for asserting that those are sets of information held by the authorities? How do you know? So you've told us with some confidence, it must be said.
Some of it's been avowed. I mean, the place to look is an organisation it used to be called GTAC, probably in your day, Chairman. It's now NTAC, the National Technical Advisory Centre, based at Thames House. And it's already been recognised, I think, in public by ministers that Intercept data is there. These are the people who handle most of the requests from all the agencies. It's been in the public domain that there's a financial set, which I assume is credit cards and bank records, because GCHQ got a title for it, SIM. Flights, I think we know. The rest, that was the question. Whether or not they've got ANPR, it would be very surprising if they've got this and they haven't put ANPR on it, for example. If I were going to build a database like this, given their purpose, that's what I'd do. So I think it's something that needs to be answered. And one of the things that's been said by a number of security journalists, for a start, who know their way around this, is that they think there are hundreds of data sets, not one, not five.
Do you worry in listing these data sets as you just have that you have given some very helpful information to serious organised crime gangs and terrorists and others?
In that case, I'd arrest Malcolm Rifkind, because he drew it to the public record in March of the last year, and it was only when that was done that this was put under the Intelligence Commissioner's oversight. Until then, there was no oversight whatsoever. And I'm afraid in a democracy it is necessary to look at what you're doing, and you can only do that by discussing it.
I think the scope very definitely has to be well defined, which it isn't at the moment. There's also the fact that once you've got warrants for this bulk information, then access is much freer. So once you've got it, there's stacks and stacks of stuff in there that you can just freely search at whenever you have an appropriate moment. So it's not just a one-off sort of search.
All right. Question to both of you. What is the correct balance between the democratic accountability of ministers and the independent oversight of judges in the authorisation of warrants? Does the draft bill get this right?
I suppose what I would like to have seen was a little bit more of the judges being able to look at the legal aspects of whether or not to grant a warrant. And I think that's lacking at the moment, because politicians vary enormously in their skills and just may not be the best people to have that sort of last word or ruling.
Our approach to this, and that of some of the Commonwealth countries, is based really on the royal prerogative concept of government. But whether it adds accountability, I would dispute, absolutely. Jack Straw always used to say that when you're in trouble, the safest place to be is the dispatch box of the House of Commons. And when it's a terrorist event, that's certainly true. I mean, I was the opposition spokesman who responded to Charles Clarke on the day of the 7/7 attack, and you can be quite sure that the aim of the opposition at that point was not to embarrass the government. It was to show solidarity against an outsider, and that's what always happens. Chairman, you may remember Gibraltar, when the Labour Party was very supportive, even though there were some doubts on the day, very supportive. Time and time, even a few weeks ago, when we had the drone attack, there were some differences between the Prime Minister's approach in the Chamber and what was written to the United Nations, but nobody went for that, because we and the public take a view on this. Secondly, when you're coming to warrants, it's very often illegal for the minister to actually talk about it publicly anyway. I suspect you've had some ministers here on this. To talk is legally forbidden. So the pressure on a minister to be accountable is near zero. If you look in Hansard, you'll find a number of parliamentary questions down from me asking the mundane thing of what law, what statute was this done under? And I get the answer, we never comment on security matters. So we don't even know. That's how accountable it is. We don't even get an answer about which statute is being used. So I think, firstly, the accountability argument is a chimera, and it's a problem for countries like the States, who take a very different view of royal prerogative than we do, obviously, given their foundation. And many of them view the idea of a ministerial approval as being rather flawed. To take up the Baroness's point on skill, we're very unusual at the moment. We've got a very competent Home Secretary who's been there for over 5 years. When I was Shadow Home Secretary for 5 years, I think I had 4 opponents, one after another. Plunkett, Clarke, Reid and Smith. So the typical tenure of a Home Secretary is about 2.5 years. About a year getting into the job, a year understanding it, and they're on their way. And what do? What does this warrantry process consist of? 2,345 warrants last year, 2,700 odd in total, but 2,345 signed by the Home Secretary. That is about 9 a day on a working day. If you assume she does 1 or 2 before going to church in a hurry on Sunday, it's about 9 a day on working days, 50 weeks a year. That's not long enough to do this. 15, 20 years ago, they were about 1,000 a year. And I spoke to one of the Home Secretaries who did it then. He said, you never, even at 1,000 a year, it was too many. You never got enough information to make a judgment. You got a précis of the case. You can't make a judgment on something as intrusive as this on a précis. You get no chance really to do much cross-questioning.
Forgive me, which Home Secretary is this?
You will have to call him yourself.
No, I can't if you haven't told me.
I'm not going to tell you without his
permission.
permission.
So this is hearsay?
I'm just telling you. You can work it out, actually, if you try a little bit hard. But 1,000 a year. 1,000 a year is what they did then. It's now 2,000, heading to 2,500 and going up. So I think from that point of view, now compare that against using a judge or a panel of judges. Firstly, they're more expert. They're in the job for a long time. They've done a lot of, look like SIAC. Look at SIAC, the example of SIAC. We could actually, if we were smart about it, do what the Americans do and put up effectively a special advocate to challenge and to make sure that the public interest is maintained. And so that is the way to do it. That's much more effective than this way. This way, I'm afraid, it'll improve it slightly, but it sort of misses the optimum outcome.
A simple question: who judges the judges?
Well, we're going to have a whole new procedure in place of other judges, and that's just like the normal. Most judicial systems have a structure to them where things are reviewed further up, and that's what's happened here. And I think that bit of this bill, by the way, is a good bit of this bill. The putting together of the overarching commissioners is a very good piece of this bill. That was I think that's straight out of Anderson, and Anderson was exactly right.
But what we're talking about here is high-level authorisation. A lot of the authorisations, I heard the police officers earlier talking about who was going to be able to give such authorisations. And it can be, in fact, a much lower level. A detective sergeant was found last year who was giving out authorisations. And
for warrants, intercept warrants.
Yes, yes.
That is not.
No, but it's an indication of where a structure can break down, because that detective sergeant didn't even know that journalists had a duty and a right to protect their sources. And so things can decay in use, and that's my experience of the Met Police.
Is the proposed procedure for urgent applications appropriate? This is for urgent applications of warrants for intercept. Part 1 written.
We have different views on this, as is apparent from the answer to Lord Butler earlier. I think it's broadly appropriate. I think 5 days is quite a long time, even in the civil service. And so I think it can be shorter than that. But as I said, we should publish the number of times we use these every year. We should establish some clear criteria. I would be inclined to say, obviously, if it's an imminent life and death, that's a no-brainer. But there are a few others that may be not quite so clear-cut. The London-Glasgow bombing, which is one example, wasn't an immediate imminent life and death. It was 12 hours away, as it were, before the attack. But they were, as it were, slipping away. They needed to move quickly with what information they had. And it's very, very hard to legislate for that. So you have to allow a little bit of tolerance in the urgency. It may also be, under some circumstances, that there are the possibility of losing information. Information is only available for a very short time period. But I think if you just take those three completely different criteria, it demonstrates actually urgency is rather hard to define. It's very easy to recognise, hard to define. But I think we could certainly write the statute to cover that.
What you're saying, Mr. Davis, is that with regard to the urgency ones, because in your previous answer to Lord Butler, you would advocate, first of all, that the time of 5 days is shortened.
Yes.
And secondly, that there might be some special investigatory process for those urgent ones to ensure that they've been dealt with properly as urgent.
As urgent, that's right. I mean, the other thing which I didn't mention, Lord Chairman, is that, of course, under my preferred approach, which is a permanent on-duty judge, you're going to have less of a problem most of the time, unless we're happy to wake up the Home Secretary every moment of the day and night. You'd have a 24-hour panel, so you'd still need it. You still need a process, but it's the sort of thing I'd only expect to be used relatively few times a year, single to double figures, no more than that.
Ms. Fernandez.
Have either of you ever authorised any warrants?
I've refused to authorise one.
Sorry?
I have refused to authorise one.
Right. So is that to be read that you have not been involved directly with any authorisation of warrants in your roles?
Except for the one occasion.
One case. Okay.
Thank you. Can we move now to Mr. MacDonald?
You've both made pretty clear your views on having this double lock of, first of all, politician and then a judge. But assuming we retain that double lock, what standard of review is appropriate?
Well, this has been quite an area of argument, of course, because what the bill says is judicial review standards. And, of course, that leads you down all sorts of routes. If you take Wednesbury standards, which is a sort of procedural, minister must have been out of his head, then clearly that's not good enough. Often as that may happen, you know. The real standard, and it's why I wonder why they put in judicial review standards. It's basically, it should be a judgment about necessity and proportionality, and that's what should be there. Now there have been debates. I think you've had David. Have you had David Panic in front of you? No, but you've had people quoting him, I'm sure. Yeah. And he says, well, in the case of these things, it's not really Wednesbury, it really is a proportionality when it's human rights things. But he was citing cases where people's liberty was at risk, basically in SIAC and so on, which is quite serious. And in the very next paragraph of his article, he then talks about how judges don't like to overrule the executive, don't like to overrule the ministers, and particularly don't like to overrule them when it's a matter of national security. So you've got to balance both ways. So I think one of the things this bill needs is absolutely explicit explanation of how the judge will make the decision. So there's no doubt about it. I mean, I also think it's a problem about the judge going immediately after Home Secretary. It's a pretty brave judge that turns over a Home Secretary.
Mm-hmm. The thoughts, Baroness Jones?
I feel more or less the same way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the two former Secretaries of State that we had before us were both sort of horrified at the notion that you'd have sort of detailed scrutiny or intensive scrutiny of decisions involving things like life and death, but you seem to be the opposite way around, that these are the ones that would require sort of a higher standard of scrutiny from judges.
Sorry, say it again. What did they say to you?
They seem to be aghast at any sort of notion that a judge would engage in a very sort of strict and detailed scrutiny of decisions on, say, imminent matters of life and death, for example.
But judges are trained to look at evidence and assess the evidence and assess whether or not a course of action is appropriate. I would argue that surely is a better route.
So you would essentially just want the judge to make a decision fresh themselves based on the same evidence? Simple as that?
If you really had to have a, quotes, double lock, and I think it's a silly title for it, it's more like a loose latchkey, but if you really had to have a double lock, then I'd do judge first.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, you've mentioned David Panic's article, but we've heard evidence from Lord Judge, who is the former Lord Chief Justice, the head of the Judiciary, and Sir Stanley Burnton, who is the Interception of Communications Commissioner. And they've both, senior judges, experienced in this area of law, they've both said that the judicial review test here necessarily imports the test of necessity and proportionality, and it is the right test, and it does strike the right balance. So are you disagreeing with
Yes,
those?
I am. Yes, I am. And let me explain. Let me give you an example of why. It's from the intelligence area, but it's not from Intercept. If you go and look at the case of Binyam Mohammed, when the Court of Appeal, I think it was considering whether or not to put in the public domain a 5-line summary, nothing harder than that, a 5-line summary of the fact that the British state had been likely colluding in torture. It took them months to get round to doing it because they were so reticent about overturning the opinion of a foreign secretary. They only eventually did it when an American court actually published the hard data. And then they said, and even then they redacted their own judgment in terms of comments about the agencies. Now it's a very good parable, but it's not the only one, of judges being very cautious, and you can understand why, but very cautious about critiquing an existing government decision, existing Secretary of State's decision, particularly quickly and particularly over national security. I mean, they are susceptible to the same. They're not saints. Judges are as variable as ministers in some respects, but they are human, and they do not like. They want to be the person who says no, you can't do that, and then somebody gets killed, which is, after all, the end of the day, the core question in all of this.
Don't you think that for transparency purposes, if there's a threat of an imminent attack, that actually for accountability, legitimacy, and reassurance for the public, it's the Home Secretary, it's a minister who will need to face members of the public on making a decision, not a judge behind closed doors?
Americans don't find that. Americans face just
We're
the
not
just.
America. We're not America.
No, I'm just you asking me for. So I'll give you an example of where it doesn't happen, and the Americans don't find that. I also don't. I have not seen a single example in my time in the House of a minister being held to account for a failure of the services. Just the reverse. Just the reverse. Go back and look at 7/7. The opposition very carefully, some may remember, did not call for an inquiry into that. Why? Because the actions of the political body in toto is to act in solidarity. not to challenge each other at that point in time. So the accountability argument doesn't stand up. I don't think the public even are aware most of the time of individual warrantry. And also, we're talking about terrorism. And let's be clear about this, because I may have a different view to other members of this committee. Terrorism's not a war, it's a crime. By calling it a war, we give advantage to the other side. It's a crime. We don't require ministers to sign off warrants on other crimes. I don't see why the public would necessarily expect them to sign a warrant on this. What the public want is a safer outcome and not intrusion, with a minimum of intrusion into their lives. How it's done, they won't be worried about the procedure.
Ms Atkins?
There is also the fact that it is very hard for any Home Secretary or any minister to say no to the security services if they are saying this is a matter, you must do it, you've got no choice. Whereas I would have thought far better to rely on a judge having looked at the evidence and assessed it properly.
I don't necessarily agree with that, to be honest. I think the current Home Secretary does say no to some.
I would agree that Theresa May is doing a splendid job.
Yeah, well, that wasn't the point I was making. I mean, I think she does say no to some. The one I'm unwilling to name, but I'll ask him if he wants to name himself, certainly said no to some, more than some. So I do think they take it seriously, but I just think they're making a decision on a précis. And this is a life-changing decision, and sometimes a life-saving decision, on the basis of a précis.
I didn't say they wouldn't, I just said it's hard.
Miss Atkins, and then Lord Strasburger, and quickly, Pete, because then we've got to get the Bishop's chest.
I think, as Mr Davis, you said that it would be a brave judge that stood up to the Home Secretary. Doesn't that undermine your argument that judges should be solely responsible for this process? Because if they're not brave enough to stand up to the Home Secretary or the Foreign Secretary or the Northern Irish Secretary, one wonders how much they are adding to the whole process.
There are good and poor procedures, and this is my view as a poor procedure. That's the point. It's what are the pressures built into procedure? And you design judicial procedures to give a fair outcome, and you design these procedures to give the best outcome, the optimum judgment from the judge. And this is not what we do.
Slight change of tack. Some jurisdictions have a method for informing those who have been subject to surveillance after the event, after the case is concluded, thereby giving them an opportunity for seeking redress, perhaps in our case through the IPT or perhaps through the normal courts. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, the procedures, the countries that do that, it's quite constrained. Obviously, if somebody is still subject to investigation, it's never going to happen. And if there's an ongoing case, still it's never going to happen. And even if it's the next door neighbour, it's not going to happen. But nevertheless, I think the existence of such a procedure is very good discipline on the agencies themselves and on the people making decisions, because that way mistakes will out eventually. But it's more about, frankly, I think in all of them, a relatively small number are ever declared, but the existence of the system is quite good, the existence of the procedure.
I just wanted to return to this whole politicians against judges argument. Yeah. I mean, isn't the whole point about political accountability? So who judges the judges question, but the politician in this scenario is trying to achieve something different, which is unique threat, unique capacity for scale of death and slaughter, and making a decision quickly. The judge is fundamentally doing something very different, which their training teaches them to do. It's fundamentally different to the politician's job. Why do you think that political accountability should go from a process where it's only about judges applying simply the letter of the law, making a judgment on the day, but not worrying about any of the other ramifications that might have for our national security?
Well, let's imagine for a second, and I think I've said twice now, so forgive me, Chairman, if I'm repeating myself for the third time, but that the operation of the House of Commons in particular, in terms of affecting accountability, and indeed the operation of the British media, because the British media also sort of goes shoulder to shoulder at the time this sort of attack happens, is not one that delivers conventional accountability. Let's imagine for a second we had a Spanish situation. Remember, one of the reasons we redesigned the Conservative Party, when I was Shadow Home Secretary, redesigned our approach to what we would do in the event of a terrorist attack was because of what happened in Spain. I did not want. I thought this might happen as it happened in the general election in Spain. I thought it might happen in the general election in Britain. So I thought this is not going to happen in Britain. But let's imagine for a second we didn't, and we tore into the Home Secretary of the day because the agency had fallen down on this, that, and the other. And the truth of the matter is they did fall down on some things. I'm not going to replicate them here, but it's easy to look up. Then the last thing to be worried about is who signed off the warrant. It really would be. I mean, it would be what didn't work. What didn't work? What didn't work? We know what didn't work. They had information about Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, and they had a photograph, and they cut it the wrong way and sent it around in an unrecognisable form. This procedure does not add to the accountability. It seriously undermines the effectiveness of the process.
But your argument is a very compelling takedown of the political class being a bit rubbish, which we may or may not agree with, but you have a point about accountability. But isn't that a better argument for improving political accountability in the system, making us work harder in the Commons, making us work harder as an opposition, rather than say politicians are rubbish? Let's just hand it over to the judges who apply a whole different set of principles.
I'm not saying politicians are rubbish. What I am saying is they're only as good as the information that they're given. And quite honestly, having watched the Met over the past 16 years, I know that they can be extremely selective about the information that they give you. That may not be true for the security services, I don't know, but I think it likely is.
But if we accept rubbish information, then we are failing to do our political job. I still haven't heard an argument that says we should move away from the realm of political accountability to legal accountability.
That's the misrepresentation of the argument. The second legal issue here is that I think you'll find for most of these warrants they're forbidden to tell anybody, even the House of Commons. So, again, go back, look. I mean, I'm not sure whether I haven't read that piece of this bill, 299 pages. I can't remember anyway what it said on it. But most of the time, these warrants are incapable of being put in the public domain. So, you have a problem there too. The accountability does not work at this level, and you've got to say to yourself at the end of the day, what are you trying to do? You're trying to have a counter-terrorism policy that works, and works very well in terms of its effectiveness against terrorism, and works as well as you can make it in terms of protection of privacy. Those are the two things, and we're trying to find an optimum in that. Nobody says either side has an absolute, I hope, but we're trying to find an optimum in that. The optimum seems to me much better with a fully trained judge, with lots of time, with the full case, at any time of night or day, because you'll have a panel of them, with possibly a special advocate to argue the counter case, with guaranteed to make a better decision than the Minister.
Lord Strasbourg, very briefly, and then the Bishop's Chest.
I have to say that the Bishop and I are the only people here who are on the panel who are not politicians.
You. I'll tell you afterwards.
Thank you. Some people have suggested that a way out of this conundrum is to keep the Secretary of State involvement in cases of national security and leave it to the judges for the rest. Would that open it up for you?
Well, in fact, all of the reports, the ISC set the level at one level. I think it was just taking crime out. The RUSI set it a bit higher, national security, and Anderson set it a little higher still, effectively defence and foreign. And I think Anderson had a good argument when it came down to what I think of as the Angela Merkel conundrum, that if you are going to bug a foreign head of state, and I'm sure we don't do it, if you're going to bug a foreign head of state, then there are political consequences. There are diplomatic consequences to almost any foreign operation. So I would have a rather different approach. In fact, actually, I think the approach in the bill is okay for foreign operations. Actually, it's okay for foreign operations. So I would draw it somewhere there. I would not. I've forgotten who said it now. Forgive my poor memory, but too much German wine. Somebody said foreign and significant people in the UK. Sort of people. I don't accept that one. I think that would be a very bad idea because you get back into all of the establishment stuff and so on. So broadly speaking, I can see a very strong argument for foreign. I can see that. But outside that, no.
Not national security.
National security is such a hard thing to define. I mean, if you're talking terrorism, we're no longer. Whatever the Prime Minister says, we're no longer talking an existential threat. This is not the Soviets or the Nazis, right? Under those circumstances, you could see some sort of argument there. Clearly defined national security. National security now is a very, very broad-based thing with very, very small number of targets. I would be inclined to say you'd have to do a narrower definition than that for me, to be sure.
Thank you for your
Lady
indulgence.
Jones.
Well, perhaps I would say that there's two problems with the whole that concept, and that is, first of all, definitions are not clearly enough defined in here. Whether we're talking national security or operational purpose or whatever, the definitions are at times quite slack. The second thing is that the intelligence is likely to be shared. There's actually no limit on sharing the information with our allies, for example, with the Five Eyes. And I think that's a big problem because, it's all very well to accumulate information on what we see as our own national security, but will it impact on others?
Thank you very much. Move now to the non-political Bishop of Chester. And I think
I've been thinking that if we'd had Owen Patterson and David Blunkett with the two of you, we'd have needed a week for the meeting, really. Owen Patterson gave an impassioned defence of accountability at the dispatch box as being the only appropriate accountability in a democracy.
Did he give an example?
Well, when we had Lord Judge, any suggestion to him that the judge wouldn't be entirely independent and able to stand up to all comers was regarded as an offensive suggestion, not least from someone like me. Okay. Given the architecture,
judges are all saints.
This was what Lord Judge said. Given the architecture as we actually have it, how can we improve? Turn the latchkey into a double lock, as it were. I mean, the judge is appointed by the Prime Minister, not the Judicial Appointments Commission. Yeah. He's reappointed every 3 years. Is there a way of taking the architecture, flawed though it may be, and actually strengthening it, making the judicial thing stronger, more independent?
You can't make it the best in the world. You can't make it world-leading, which is what's claimed for this. Mind you, Malcolm Rifkin claimed that the last system was world-leading too. So you can't make it that. If you want to improve at the edges, then certainly have the Judicial Appointments Panel appoint the relevant judges. It's a technical calling, a technical decision, not a political one. Certainly have longer tenures or maybe even single tenures, because judges I know are inhumanly strong, but they may unconsciously be affected by that. One of the things I thought in the bill, which was a very bad idea, was effectively it looked as though the Home Secretary judge made the decision on the funding, and that shouldn't be done that way. There should either be a sort of Barnett formula for security, sort of this fraction goes. If you increase the size of the intelligence budget or the secret budget, then you give a certain 0.1% or whatever it might be, make it a formula. Or alternatively, you just have a direct negotiation between the lead judge and the Treasury. You mustn't have the person being checked up on deciding on the funding.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms Fernandez.
Lord Butler would recognise an NAO model, basically.
On the Wilson doctrine.
Mr Warman to start off.
Pardon?
I'm passing on to Mr Warman to start.
All right, so you reversed, okay.
Well, it's a tag team, but you might not notice. Do you think that this bill adequately enshrines the Wilson doctrine in statute?
Lord Wilson died a long time ago, and so did this policy, I think. It's always been a very tenuous policy, the Wilson doctrine, because it's always down to, if I do this, I'll tell the House when I think it's appropriate.
That's right.
That's almost certainly not soon, in most cases, by which time the individual Prime Minister has moved on. And I will be amazed, to be frank with you, somewhat shocked even, if no member of, in the classifications here, members of Parliament had ever been intercepted. I mean, I could think of some good reasons over the decades. So I don't think it's quite what it's seen to be in the public domain. It's not a ban on intercepting MPs at all. Now, I would not, in fact, I would take this away from the Prime Minister altogether. I can see even less reason for a politician to judge on whether or not you should tap a politician's phone. You think of the arguments we've had in the last few weeks. Jeremy Corbyn has been called a threat to national security. You know, now, I don't know, I guess it's just hyperbole, but nevertheless, it does introduce a question as to who should do this. So it seems to me it's different criteria, and by the way, it's different to what's written in the bill too. It says MPs and their constituents. In a way, the MPs to constituents link is almost the least worrisome, because it's the least interesting to the agencies. MPs to whistleblowers, MPs to journalists, in fact MPs to anybody is what I would make that, and I would make that criterion high. Now, it's not just MPs, mind you. I mean, this is a general privileges issue, and it relates to journalists. The government, of course, jumped and fixed straight away, but as you guess why. But the group you're looking at: lawyers, MPs, doctors, clerics, I suppose, and journalists, and none of them should be completely immune. I say that, again, Chairman, you may remember, at one point some of the terrorist groups in Northern Ireland used doctors, surgeries, receptionists as handoff points, really. So you can't make anybody immune, but you have to just have a slightly higher, well, more than slightly, a significantly higher threshold, and it's really got to be a judge. It's really got to be a judge that makes a decision. So that's how I would deal with it.
I've asked the Met about this, and they call us privileged people, those people that do come into this group of having certain rights and duties and so on. And they apparently don't have a list of us. And obviously that list will be changing all the time in any case, but they don't have a list. And so it's down to the authorising person checking whether or not this person might be a privileged person and whether or not the Prime Minister should be told about the warrant. And, you know, it's all very, very specious,
Sorry.
I'd say.
Chairman, I forgot one point. One of the things that's become apparent in the last couple of years, and it's always been true, but it's just become apparent, is that communications data is not subject to the Wilson Doctrine. Now, communications data is much, much more important now than intercept, particularly if you're talking about whistleblowers. We have just changed the law in the last year or two, Chairman, to make MPs prescribed people from the point of view of whistleblowers, to provide them with employment protection. So if a whistleblower comes to an MP, then he gets protection, he or she gets protection. And this is important. I mean, in the Damien Green case, you may remember Damien Green's arrest was after a whistleblower in the Home Office was in contact with him. You know. So that's precisely the sort of thing you've got to protect. So this has to apply, Wilson Doctrine has to apply not simply to intercept, but to all categories covered in this bill. All categories.
And as I understand it, you're suggesting that these privileged positions should in particular be solely a judge rather than having two politicians, as is currently proposed in the bill, rather than one.
Yes, I would do that.
And would you've said that you would extend that to journalists. Would you care to have a stab at defining a journalist in the modern age?
No, I wouldn't. But I'll leave that to parliamentary draftsmen. The most important group for me is lawyers. Let me tell the committee why, because I think that this is another of these areas where the government's got the threat back to front. The simple truth is that I think when you were in a cabinet, Chairman, the rule was that if a criminal was being intercepted and he started talking to his lawyer, the tape was switched off and the intercept was ceased at that point. That was the rule as it was understood by the Home Secretary in your day. That is no longer true. It metamorphosed, the IPT's inquiries in this, metamorphosed into the data being recorded but kept in a flagged, privileged way and not shown to the prosecution counsel in any case. Now that's not true, and the data is made available to the prosecution counsel. Now, at some time or other, when one of these comes out, we're going to have a hardened terrorist released onto the streets because of the failure of equality of arms in British law, because this is madness. And how that metamorphosis happened, I don't know, but it's happened broadly in the last decade or so, or decade or two. And it seemed to me we really have to fix that. This bill has to fix that.
It's so incredibly complex, this area. And you, Lord Chairman, you asked at the very beginning, is this bill even suitable? And I would argue, in fact, that circumstances have almost at this stage moved beyond the bill, because I took the liberty of sending some of you an encrypted email yesterday, and quite honestly, any criminal, any terrorist could do exactly the same. And you need the, you know, this bill won't deal with that sort of thing.
Thank you. Ms Fernandez, finally.
My
You be this. Well, that was a fascinating and a lively debate. So
Well, it was better than the Berlin Christmas market.
I'm not sure if it's better than the Christmas party.
Chairman, there's a few issues you haven't covered with us, and I know we're tight on time. Can I write to you?
of course, that applies to both you and Lady Jones. If there are things you'd want to add to what you've told us this afternoon, we'd be very welcome for you to do that.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed. Grateful.